Good. Okay, guys. Well, hello once again. This is Once Upon a Whiskey. The wolf here, it's a symbol of unity of society, like a wolf pack. So let's pretend that only for tonight we are some sort of a wolf pack and you guys are following me through this weird and wonderful world of whiskey. And well, by the way, I forgot to mention this before, but tomorrow is going to be the World Whisky Day. So happy World Whisky Day to all of you. And I hope you enjoy some whiskeys. Also, part of the development of this box, it was to bring you like international whiskies as well. I know that three of them are Scotch, but one is Japanese and the other one is Irish. So you will have like an overview of different whiskies, different styles, and different things going on in the whiskey industry. So well, anyway, let's just start with the session and let's go for the first whiskey of the night, which is gonna be Nikka Days, the Japanese one. So please, guys, pour yourself a dram of this one and let's see how it goes. This one in particular, I would say it's a very good starting point. It's only 40% ABV, meaning that it's supposed to be lighter, softer, delicate, easier to drink in comparison to the other whiskeys. This one here, as you can read in the label, it's a blended whiskey, so it means it has been blended with quite a few different whiskeys from Japan. And well, let me give you here a quick introduction on what actually is Japanese whiskey. So, well, first of all, Japanese, as you can see here, well, they are also a big whiskey producer. They are doing lots of like brands, whiskeys, distilleries, and the industry in Japan, it's basically booming right now. Everybody's crazy about Japanese whiskeys becoming very expensive, very difficult to find, and highly collectible as well, like highly regarded by whiskey investors or whiskey collectors. So, well, some of the curious facts of Japanese whiskey. Well, is the first whiskey distillery in Japan was Yamazaki, was founded in 1923. Kampai is the way to say cheers in Japan, in Japanese. Basically, if you want to say cheers or slanjiva or slange, as we would say here in Scotland, you just say Kampai. So Kampai, guys, by the way, feel free to enjoy your whiskey. Go ahead and take a look of the color, give it a smell, give it a try. Think about the aftertaste and mix it with a little bit of water if you want. Obviously, that's an optional step, but if you want to do it, I will definitely recommend to add maybe just a few drops, 3 or 4 drops of water will be more than enough. You guys continue enjoying your whiskey, and I will be telling you the story. So, Mizunara, it's a very particular type of Japanese oak. I'm gonna give you more details about this later on. It's Japanese oak that you can only find in Japan. However, it's very particular and it has quite a few complications that I'm going to explain later on. The Japanese whiskey industry possesses some of the most highly regarded whiskeys in the world. That's totally true. Like very expensive Japanese whiskey nowadays. Also, in Japan, they don't really trade stock between distilleries as they do in Scotland, for example, is one of the main differences. In Japan, what they do is to produce different styles of whiskies under the same roof, under the same company, and then they will create their own blends by blending their own stock. They don't go to other distilleries and mix whiskies from other producers as they do here in Scotland. And mizuwari, it's a traditional cocktail made of whiskey, ice, and water. In Japan, they also have single malt, single grains, and blended Japanese whiskey. It's a very similar way, it's a very similar production process as they do here in Scotland. So basically, what do you guys need to produce a single malt Japanese whiskey? 100% malted barley. It has to distill at only one distillery. It's usually distilled in copper pot stills, and it's usually a very small batch distillation. So they can only produce very small quantities batch after batch. A single grain whiskey, on the other hand, it's going to be a mix of grains. It can be wheat, barley, corn, or rye. It can be a mix of them as well. It has to be distilled at only one distillery, hence the word single, because you might be wondering how come it's a single if it's a mix of grains. So in this case, the word single, it makes reference to one distillery. It has to be distilled in a column still, which is basically like a different style, a different technology for alcohol creation. I'm going to show you some more details about this later on. And usually they will be able to produce massive quantities of alcohol in a very short period of time. So it will be more like an industrial production process rather than craft production process as they do with the single malts. And well, of course, they have also blended whiskey, which it can be a mix of whatever they have. You know, it can be a mix of single malts or a mix of single grains or a mix of single malts and single grains, which is the case of Nikka Days, the whiskey that you guys are drinking right now. Also, yeah, let me show you something here. I want to show you some more details. This rules that I'm going to show you right now in the infographic, these things, it's basically what they have defined as Japanese whiskey. Before 2021, last year, the rules or the production methods and processes for for Japanese whiskey, they were completely undefined. So the distilleries, they were pretty much able to do whatever they wanted to do. And even some producers, they were mixing Japanese whiskey with other whiskeys around the world, and they were selling that as Japanese whiskey. So in order to avoid this, the industry, they decided to standardize their production and their methods and the rules and laws for whiskey production. And basically they they summarize everything in this slide that I'm showing you right now. So they can use malted grains or other cereal grains, you know, malted barley, wheat, corn, what else is there? Rye, for example, these kind of things. Not rice, rice. Some Japanese distilleries, they produce whiskey with rice, but they cannot sell that product in the European Union or in the UK as whiskey. They will have to call it somewhere else, something else. It has to be carried out or distilled in a distillery in Japan. It cannot be distilled at a higher strength of 95% ABV. The minimum time of maturation, it's at least 3 years, which is basically the same as in Scotland. The maximum capacity of the cask, it cannot be bigger than 700 liters, which once again, it's very similar to Scotland. The minimum strength at distillation, it cannot be lower than 40% ABV. And in Scotland, in Japan, as they do in Scotland, they are allowed to use plain caramel coloring to modify the color of their whiskies. However, this practice, it's more common for bigger producers, you know, like usually the blenders, for example. In the case of Scotland, I would say Johnny Walker, Chivas Regal, White and Mackay, Famous Grows, these big companies, these big brands, they usually modify the color of their whiskies by adding artificial plain caramel coloring. And in Japan, it's also allowed. Okay, let's continue here. Let me give you some quick details also about the industry, just some interesting facts. So Japanese whiskey, as I told you before, it's becoming increasingly expensive. And this Yamazaki single malt 50-year-old, it's been one of the most expensive Japanese whiskey ever sold in the history of whiskey. At an auction, it went for $129,000, which is one bottle. It's quite expensive, I would say. Also, this is like the journey of the distilleries in Japan. In 2007, only 7 distilleries. In 2017, 15 distilleries, and nowadays, or well, last year, 2021, there were 38 Japanese whiskey distilleries producing some good whiskey in Japan. And well, this guy that you can see here, it's the one and only Masataka Taketsuru. This guy is considered to be the father of the Japanese whiskey industry. And actually, it's very funny or very interesting because this guy, he came to Scotland in 1918 and he studied chemistry at the University of Glasgow, actually in the city where I live, at the university that I went. So he studied chemistry. At that time, chemistry, it was basically distillation 101. So he learned everything about distillation. And then after he finished his studies, he worked for a couple of distilleries in the Highlands and in Campbelltown in the west coast of Scotland. He learned everything about distillation, like whiskey distillation. And then with this knowledge, he went back to Japan, and with the business guy, with Shinjiro Tori, they both created the first whiskey distillery in Japan, which they call it Yamazaki. It was the very first one, as I showed you in one of the previous slides. And well, this notebook that you can see in the upper side of your screen, this notebook here with the notes and everything, those are the original notes that he made when he was studying and learning about whiskey distillation. As you can see, he even draw the pot still and everything. So this is basically what they replicated in Japan. And well, this lady here that you can see is his wife. This is the famous Rita. She's a Scottish woman. So they met in Scotland and then together they traveled to Japan. And well, people say, history say that this Rita, she was very important part of his business journey and his journey as an entrepreneur and as a whiskey personality. So that's the one, Rita. And well, let's talk about particularly Nikka whiskey. So Nikka, it's a combination of two different whiskies. On one hand, whiskies from Miyagikyo and whiskies from Yoichi. So Miyagikyo and Yoichi both are Nikka distilleries, all right? Remember that before I mentioned that usually Japanese whiskey producers, they don't exchange whiskies from distilleries to distilleries, except they belong to the same company. In this case, Yoichi and Miyagikyo, they belong to Nikka, which is like the umbrella corporation. Whiskies from Miyagikyo, they tend to be very light, delicate, very, very easy to drink. I would say very soft and bland and very, like plain. Some people would describe these whiskies like that. And Yoichi, they are a much more complex and flavorful style of whiskey. So this Nikka that you guys are drinking right now is going to be a combination of single malts and single grain whiskies from both distilleries. Particularly single grain whiskey from Miyagikyo and single malt whiskey from Yoichi. Those are like the ingredients of this particular dram. Okay, let's continue. This is the distillery of Miyagikyo. So basically this one here in the west east coast of Japan, and Yoichi, well, these are the pot stills of Miyagikyo. And this one here is Yoichi, which I would say it's a bit prettier than Miyagikyo. And this is, well, something very interesting from the inside of the distillery. These are the pot stills. And as you can see in the picture, they are still using very old-fashioned traditions in the production process. So instead of using, like electricity or gas as they do here in Scotland, like usually pot stills at distilleries in Scotland, they work as a kettle. They get the heat and the higher temperatures through electricity or gas. In the case of this distillery in Japan, they are still using coal to direct fire the pot stills, and that's the way they are distilling the alcohol. So what happens when you create whiskey in this very old-fashioned way? You will create a much more complex, like a meaty and yeah, like a flavorful style of whiskey as well. So this one here is Yoichi, and remember this one here is going to be Miyagikyo, which is more like a softer, lighter style of alcohol. Okay, and well, when it comes about the cask, well, distilleries in Japan, they are using a wide variety of barrels. They are using American oak that previously held American whiskey, sherry cask from Spain, European barrels from France, Italy, Portugal, etc. But as I mentioned before, in Japan, they also like to use a very particular style of oak and cask, which is well known as the Mizunara oak barrels, and it comes from a tree which basically it looks like this one. I don't know if it's that colorful, but the wood, it's definitely like this. So it's using this particular type of wood or tree. It has some complications. As you can see, it doesn't grow straight, meaning that the working with this type of tree and wood, it's a little bit more complicated than just the American oak or the Spanish oak, for example. Also, it's a bit more porous than the American oak, meaning that the risk of leaks of like leaking whiskey is going to be much more higher than using traditional American oak, for example. And the wood itself, it's a bit more difficult to work with in comparison to other oak barrels. So as you can imagine, it delivers lots of complexity, and it's also very, very expensive to produce whiskey in this particular type of oak. Generally speaking, an American oak barrel of around 250 liters of capacity, it will cost around $250, $200 more or less, something like this. A whiskey barrel made of Japanese Mizunara oak, it will cost around $4,000 for just one particular cask. So as you can imagine, the whiskey, in this particular type of wood, it's going to be very, very expensive as well. I was checking some prices about Japanese whiskey matured in this particular barrel, and they can easily reach 7,000 pounds for just one bottle of this very famous Japanese whiskey. So, well, as you can imagine, if you want to try some good Japanese matured in Japanese oak, well, you will need to have a big pocket to buy one of these very fancy bottles. And also, based on studies and their own experience, they say that maturing whiskey in this particular type of oak, um, it's not a good idea if you want to mature whiskey for just a couple of years. If you want to use it for maybe, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, maybe 12, they say that the optimum time in this particular type of oak, when you will deliver like the maximum complexity and the majority of flavors and aromas, it will be at least 20 years. So if you mature your whiskey for less than 20 years, it's going to be a very mediocre and very like not well-rounded style of flavor. However, if you wait for the 20 years or more, then it's when magic happens and you will be able to create a fantastic whiskey. Okay, and the type of flavors that you can expect is going to be sandalwood, coconut, and spice. All right, let's continue. And well, let me tell you about the tasting notes. So this whiskey, remember, it's supposed to be very fresh, light, and delicate. You know, like in the notes, it's going to be fresh, fruity apples, pears, honey, melon, some strawberry, orange oil, sweetness, and lemon cheesecake. In the palate, it's going to be very smooth and creamy, roasted nuts, toffee apples, malted cereal, vanilla fudge, very fresh as well, and juicy apples. And the finish, it's buttery lemon, shortbread, sprinkled with sugar and vanilla pod. So in summary, this whiskey is very fresh, it's very light, easy to drink, and very sweet at the same time. It has been matured in American oak barrels for sure. Definitely not the Mizunara. This is not a 20-year-old whiskey or anything like that. It's actually quite young. I would say it's going to be between maybe 5, 6, or 7 years, but it's definitely a fresh, light, delicate, I would say a very good starting point for a whiskey tasting. Okay, let's continue. Let's go for the second whiskey of the night, which is going to be Tilling whiskey small batch, the Irish one. So please, guys, pour yourself a dram of this one, and let's see how it goes. This one here, this Tilling, in my opinion, well, so far, like at this time of my life or the year, I would say is one of my favorite Irish whiskies I have ever tried. I've been in love of this brand since many, many years ago when I discovered the brand back in 2013. I think it was the first time I had it. I thought it was very interesting. Craft distillery right in the city center of Dublin. So if you guys are planning to go to Dublin anytime soon, please go and visit the distillery. It's definitely a must place to go. And well, once again, so enjoy your whiskey. So remember, take a look of the color, give it a smell, give it a try. Think about the aftertaste, mix it with a little bit of water, and well, let's see how it goes. If you have comments, questions, or anything at all, please let me know. And I hope you enjoyed your whiskey. And as we usually say here in Scotland or in Ireland, Slanjiva, I hope you like it. I hope you enjoy it. So please go ahead. Okay, so once again, what is Irish whiskey? And well, as you can see, based on the spelling, whiskey in Ireland, it's spelled with the E, with this little E right here between the K and the Y. So for Irish whiskey and American whiskey, you spell it with the E, and for Scotch whiskey and the rest of the world, you spell it without the E. Okay, let's continue here. And so what is Irish whiskey? Let me show you once again the infographic and the map. Maybe a little bit better if I show you this one here. Irish whiskey, okay, good. So Irish whiskey, well, I would say very similar rules and laws for Irish whiskey as they do in Scotland, for example. So once again, malted. There is something important you guys need to know. In Ireland, it's the only country in the world that they will use unmalted barley in the production process as the raw material. So it's malted barley, unmalted barley, and other cereal grains like wheat, corn, rye, etc., etc. But unmalted barley, it's definitely something very unique for Irish whiskey. it has to be distilled in Ireland. The maximum strength of distillation, it cannot be higher than 94.8% ABV. Minimum of 3 years of maturation in the wood containers. The maximum capacity of the cask, it cannot be higher than 700 liters. And by the way, in Ireland, they are allowed to use different types of wood. It doesn't need to be oak. All right, so they have more like yeah, like freedom in using different styles of wood. It's kind of the opposite of in Scotland. In Scotland, it's only oak, 100% oak, either from the States or from Europe or even from Japan if you want, but it has to be oak. In Ireland, they have more freedom with that. The strength at this bottling, it cannot be lower than 40%. And once again, as in Japan and in Scotland, they are allowed to use plain caramel coloring to modify the color of their whiskey. And well, if I show you this infographic once again, so they have single malt whiskies, is basically the same as they do in Japan, as I showed you before. Single grain whiskies, once again, the same as they do in Japan. What's the different whiskey that they produce in Ireland is going to be this one here, single pot. And again, this is a very particular whiskey only made in Ireland. And that's why I was telling you, very important, like one of the grains that they use, it's unmalted barley. So single pot, it's at least 30% malted barley, at least 30% unmalted barley, and they can use up to 5% in other cereal grains, as the wheat, the rye, etc., etc. It has to be distilled in copper pot stills, and it's legally produced only in Ireland. This whiskey is very interesting, or the story is very interesting, because it was born as a tax evasion story. So basically, the English back in those days, in the 1700s, 1800s, when they started to to conquer all these like northern territories like Scotland or even Ireland as well, so they started to charge lots of taxes for the use of malted barley. Back in those days, either in Scotland or Ireland, the national drink, it was not whiskey, it was beer. So what can you do with malted barley? Beer, of course, and well, whiskey as well. So the English, they started to charge lots of taxes for the use of malted barley because they wanted to promote the consumption of gin, which is of course not produced with malted barley. You can produce gin with wheat, for example, or even corn. So that's why they were trying to discourage the consumption of malted barley in beer or whiskey in order to promote their own gin. So the Irish, they thought like, okay, well, you know what? We are not going to pay any taxes for our own whiskey or beer, so we are going to start production of our whiskey with unmalted barley in order to avoid the tax. And that's how they basically created a very particular and very unique style of whiskey, which is the single pot, made of a combination of unmalted barley and malted barley at the same time. So very interesting indeed. And blended whiskies, it can be a combination of any of the previous whiskies that I show you, single malt, single grains, or single pots. Okay, let's continue here. Yes, so let's continue. This is what I explained now. And well, quick question here. So do you know who invented whiskey, the Irish or the Scots? Any guess, any thoughts? Let me know in the comments if you know something or maybe not so much. So well, the first written evidence about Ishkibai, it's the Gaelic word for the water of life. Many years ago, either Scottish or Irish, they used to call whiskey as the water of life. It was well known that this beverage, it was able to prolong life and enhance youth. That's what they used to call it, the water of life. And the first written evidence about that word, it was discovered in Ireland in 1408, and then it was discovered in Scotland in 1494. So more or less 80 years after the Irish did, the Scottish did it. But it is also well known that either Scottish or Irish, they were distilling whiskies many years before that, even centuries before that. But well, the written evidence, it's what it counts, and that's why the Irish, they got this recognition for having created the water of life. So enjoy your Irish whiskey. Okay, this is the distillery. This is how it looks, right in the city center of of Dublin. If you ever go to Dublin, well, I definitely encourage you to go and visit the distillery. And well, what happens with the barrels that they will use for this particular whiskey that you guys are drinking just now? So it's gonna be a combination of a hogshead. It's basically American oak barrels that previously held American whiskey, and then barrels. The barrels previously held rum from Central America. So this whiskey that you guys are drinking just now is going to be a combination of American oak barrels, and then it was finished, the liquid, in rum barrels from Central America. Okay, so you might be able to find some of the coconut notes and some of the tropical flavors that the rum delivers. Think about sugar cane, for example, brown sugar, coconut, maybe a little bit of a tropical fruits like mangoes or even bananas you might be able to get with this particular whiskey. Okay, and well, this is a picture of the of one of the pot stills at Tilling Distillery. And also, well, just let me give you some quick details here about the type of distillation between single malts and single grains. So basically, a single malt whiskey, it has to be distilled in a copper pot still, which it usually looks like this. It's mostly used for single malt whiskey distillation. It is a very handcrafted production process. It is a very slow production process. It is a much more expensive whiskey to produce in comparison to single grains. And the quantity, it's going to be very small batches of production. It's one of the reasons why single malt whiskey, it's much more expensive than blended whiskey or single grains. The other type of whiskey that they will produce in Ireland and also in Japan and also in Scotland, it will be the single grain whiskey, which it has to be distilled in something like this. It's called the column still or the Coffey still. It's mostly used for single grain whiskey distillation. It is a much more effective production process. It's faster, cheaper, and they will be able to produce massive quantities of alcohol in a very short period of time, meaning that they can create industrial quantities of alcohol very quick, very fast, and very cheap. Okay, let's continue here. And well, some of the tasting notes, according to the producers of Tilling Small Batch Rum Cask. So in the nose, it's going to be cut grass and orange blossom, allspice, hint of vanilla, apple pie, and blackberries. In the palate, it's going to be spice rich palate, creamy vanilla, hints of dried herbs, and cinnamon. And the finish, it's floral, it's herbal, and just a hint of caramel. So this whiskey, once again, I would say it's slightly similar to Nikka Days, but this one definitely it has much more complexity and deliver much more flavor and characteristics than Nikka, for example. Even though this one, I would say it's still a very light, delicate, and easy whiskey to drink. Something that I forgot to mention about the distillation process and the production process, it's the triple distillation. In Ireland, they usually go for triple distillation. In Scotland, they usually go for double distillation. This is not a law, and this is not like a formal rule when it comes to whiskey production in Ireland or in Scotland. Distilleries have the freedom to decide if they want to go for double or triple distillation. But generally speaking, Irish whiskey is triple distilled, which is the case of Tilling, and generally speaking, Scotch whiskey it's double distilled. So what happens with the triple distillation? It will be able to create much more like a lighter and softer whiskey. The triple distillation kills the heavier alcohols of the spirit, meaning that the whiskey it's supposed to be more like floral, fruity, delicate, fresh, like citrus, this kind of delicate characteristics that you can find in any light and delicate whiskey. Okay, let's continue. Let's go for the third whiskey of the night, which is Syndicate 58 slash 6. I think that's the proper name. So please, guys, pour yourself a dram of this one. I assume if not all of the whiskeys before have been a new whiskey for you, I would say that probably this one it's definitely a new whiskey for the majority of you, if not all of the previous ones. But yeah, this one, I would say it has a very interesting story. So you might be wondering why that name, like why like 58/6, like why is that happening? So basically, well, it's there's a little bit of history here, and mystery as well. So basically, in 1958, that's why the 58 of the label, six friends. So six friends in 1958, they found a very rare blend of casks. They found like 10 casks. They were all storage. They were all maturing whiskey in Port of Leith in Edinburgh. They found this rare blend and they thought, okay, well, this looks very interesting. What shall we do with this whiskey? And they said, let's wait until the whiskey is 12 years old, and then we drink it, or we sell it, or we do like whatever we want to do. So they waited until the whiskey was 12 years, and they discovered that the recipe, it was actually a very interesting recipe dating back from the 1800s. So this whiskey that you guys are drinking right now, well, it's not from the 1800s, but the recipe, like the whiskeys involved in the recipe, it's like how they used to drink whiskey back in the 1800s, basically. So that's why it's like a piece of history made out of this liquid and the recipe as well. And well, the whiskey, it turned out to be so good that they started to produce this like regularly, and they started to recreate the recipe again and again and again. And nowadays, this whiskey belongs to Douglas Lang. Douglas Lang, it's an independent bottler based here in the city of Glasgow, where I live. Douglas Lang is the producers actually of one of the whiskies included in the tasting set, the Big Pete as well. I'm gonna give you more details about these guys later on. But Douglas Lang, it's an independent bottler. They are like blenders basically. They discovered this recipe and they hired a very important personality in the whiskey industry, which is Richard Patterson. Actually, let me show you the guy here. This guy, I assume you have seen this guy before. This is the master blender of Dalmore whiskey. It's basically, this is the guy behind the brand. And also many other blended whiskies, like for example, White and Mackay. He's also the nose behind White and Mackay and the Dalmore, which is one of the most highly regarded single malt whiskies in the world. So they hired this guy to recreate the original recipe from the 1800s in order to create this particular whiskey that you guys are drinking right now. So it's going to be a combination of uh, 18 single malt whiskies and 4 single grain whiskies from different distilleries and different regions across the Scotland. And also, there's something very interesting here, which is the Solera, the system that they have used to produce this particular whiskey. So it's more like a wine style of whiskey. You know, for sherry, if you guys know about sherry or if you have tried sherry before, you would know that sherry, it's usually matured using the Solera system. Solera, it means literally taken out from the soil, like from the lower side of the pyramid, if you can call it like that. So basically, the the younger sherry, it is gonna go in the upper level, like here in the sobre tablas. That's the name of the level. Then the slightly older sherry is going to be in the second criadera. Then the slightly older sherry is going to be in the first criadera. And then the oldest sherry of the Solera system is going to be in the Solera. And then the wine producers, they usually take out the wine or the sherry from the very first level, which is the Solera, and that's the sherry that we all drink, basically. So in this particular case, for this particular whiskey, they have used the same concept and the same Solera system. So the younger whiskey is going to go at the top of the pyramid, and then the older one is going to go at the bottom of the pyramid, and they usually take out the whiskey directly from the first level, which is the Solera in this case. So what's the idea of this particular system is to achieve consistency in the long term. This is not some kind of one-off production process that you will do only once and that's it. No, the idea is to do it again and again and again, and to try to some like standardize the consistency of the product for years and years and years. That's basically what you can expect from wine or the sherry or even a whiskey that has been matured using the Solera system. Okay, so well, let's answer this question here. What is Scotch whiskey? So well, very similar to the Irish whiskey. I'm not gonna give you like too much details about this. It's basically the same. Malted barley, other cereals. It has to be produced in Scotland. The strength at distillation 94.8, minimum of 3 years in the wood containers, maximum of 700 liters, and it has to be oak by law. At least 40% of ABV at bottling strength, and once again they are allowed to use plain caramel coloring in the production of Scotch whiskey. And in Scotland they produce single malt whiskies, single grain whiskies, and blended whiskies as well, which I explained before, so I don't think there's point to give you once again all the details. Okay, let's continue. And these guys here, I wanted to show you, well, since we are talking about a very historical whiskey, I wanted to to tell you a story about the very first whiskey blenders. These guys, they are well known as the whiskey barons or the whiskey blenders. So you might be able to recognize some of their names, like this guy here, Alexander Walker. He is the son of Johnny Walker. I assume Johnny Walker rings a bell. James Buchanan, also one of the famous independent bottlers or whiskey blenders. Peter Mackey and Tommy Dewar for Dewar's whiskey. By the way, James Buchanan is for J&B. It's a very popular whiskey in the States, probably here in the UK a little bit, but maybe not that much. Anyway, James Buchanan, also very famous personality. So back at the beginning of the 1800s, actually, when this whiskey, when the Syndicate 58 was created, these guys, they had the impression or the feeling that single malt whiskeys, they were too rough. They were very sharp, very inconsistent, and very, very difficult to drink, even dangerous sometimes. So they discovered that by blending whiskies from different distilleries, different regions, and different grains, they were able to achieve more consistency, better quality, and a relatively lighter, softer whiskey to drink. This whiskey, it became very, very popular, and they started to commercialize all over the UK, particularly in London, and soon after all over the world. I'm going to give you more details about this later on. Okay, so what about the barrels of this particular whiskey here? So, well, remember, it has been matured in using the Solera system, which is quite an innovation for the whiskey industry. I would say very, very interesting. This is mostly used for wine, but in whiskey, I think it's really cool, by the way. So yeah, the Solera system on one hand, and then it was finished in a sherry butt from Spain for 1 more year. So this whiskey, it's 12 years, so it means that it spent 11 years in the Solera system, and then it spent 1 more year in sherry butts from Spain, meaning that you will get this flavor from all the sherries. You know, like think about sherry wine, dried fruits, think about raisins, think about sultanas, for example, dried characteristics like nuttiness, hazelnut. What else is there? Almonds, for example, you might be able to spot in this particular whiskey coming from the sherry cask, basically. Okay. And well, something very interesting that happens during the maturation process is going to be the angel's share. The angel share, I assume some of you might know this already, but just in case, the angel share is the evaporation that happens year by year in the cask. The whiskey evaporates every single year, usually 2% every single year disappear through evaporation. It goes up to heaven, and there are only the angels, the ones who are able to enjoy that whiskey that disappeared. That's why they call it the angel's share. And there's something else that you guys need to know, which is well known as the devil's cut. The devil's cut, it's the percentage of whiskey that is absorbed by the wood in a lifetime of that particular whiskey in that particular cask. It will be around 5% in total, which is soaked by the wood, and then 2% for the angels every single year. So you guys can choose if you want to be the devil or an angel based on how much you enjoy your whiskey. Okay, and well, this is basically like a graphic representation of the angel share. So this is how it looks. New fill barrel. This is what happens after 10 years, after 15 years, and after 23 years. As you can see, the liquid is becoming less and less and less. It's evaporating, and it's also being absorbed by the wood. It's one of the reasons why a 50-year-old whiskey, it will be very, very expensive. After 50 years of maturation, there's pretty much nothing left in the cask. Okay, and well, according to their tasting notes, so this whiskey is going to be orange, well, in the nose, orange, honey, pear, ginger, and jasmine. In the palate is glassed apple, caramel, figs, and forest fruits. Remember this kind of dryness and dried fruits and forest fruits I was telling you before. And the finish is going to be rich and intense. It lingers for a while in your mouth, but at the same time, I would say it's very, very easy to drink. The ABV, it's not too high. It will be around 40% if I'm not wrong, 40 or 43. So yeah, it's supposed to be, once again, like light, delicate, easier to drink. Generally speaking, blended Scotch whiskies, that's the idea, that they are supposed to be lighter, softer, easier to drink than all of those like super rich and complex single malt whiskies from the Highlands. Which, by the way, we have a single malt whiskey included in the tasting set. So let's go to the next whiskey of the session, which is Leche, the fourth whiskey included in the box. Please, guys, pour yourself a dram of this one. Not before looking at this beautiful color. Take a look at the color. I think it's a very, very interesting color that, to be honest, I have never seen before in a whiskey. You know, it's like whiskeys are either golden and pale, or they are like very dark, like red or brown, or I don't know, mahogany or something like that. So actually, let me show you this infographic here, where you can see a wider spectrum of colors. So usually when you mature whiskeys in bourbon cask, they tend to be towards the left. You know, you will see whiskeys, they can be pale gold, pale straw, yellow gold, even amber in some cases. When you mature whiskeys in European barrels, they can be porter, brown sherry, burnt umber, mahogany. In this case, you know, in my opinion, I think it's pink. I don't know if you guys agree with me or not, but I think this is a very pink color. Which when I saw it, I was very surprised, and it was like I have never seen something like this. If I have to put this whiskey somewhere in the map, I would say probably 20. It can be a good description. Rosette Muscat, 20 Auburn, somewhere around here, I think it's the right position for this particular whiskey. So how come this is happening? Well, let's check. So by the way, take a look of the color. That's the first thing you need to do. And then the second step is going to be the nosing part. Please go ahead and give it a smell. Smell your whiskey. And I assume you are getting this smokiness, this peatiness already, like a very predominant smokiness there. So yeah, well, let's check. It's a very interesting single malt whiskey from, let me show you, from Isle of Mull. The distillery, it's Tobermory. I don't know if you guys were aware of the producer. It's Tobermory. So basically, at Tobermory distillery, they produce two brands: Tobermory on one hand and Leche on the other hand. And you might be wondering what I'm saying. What do you mean Leche? Well, basically, that's the correct pronunciation. I know that you would say like Ledaig or Ledaig or something like that, but well, you know, Scottish, they like to complicate things, and they would say Leche. That's like the correct pronunciation of this particular whiskey. And basically, what they do at Tobermory Distillery, 6 months of the year, they will produce Tobermory, which is supposed to be a very fresh, fruity, light, and delicate style of whiskey. And the other 6 months of the year, they will produce this one, the Leche, which is the smoky version of Tobermory, if you like. As a curious fact, the distillery, many years ago, when it was initially founded during the 1800s, it used to be Leche instead of Tobermory. Now they decided to change their name. The name is Tobermory, but they keep the brand, and they are producing this Leche as a secondary product. But well, this whiskey, not being interesting enough for being such like quirky color, very unusual aroma and smell, you know, like very smoky, very peaty. and it's not an Isla, it's from Isle of Mull, which you don't usually expect to drink this kind of whiskies from other regions if they are not from Isla, from this one here. Not being that enough, this whiskey here, it has been finished in, oh, by the way, yeah, a beautiful picture of the distillery. So if you want, if you're planning your next trip across to Scotland, well, definitely I would say Isle of Mull, it can be a great destination, and you guys will be able to enjoy some good quality whiskey like these guys from Tobermory or Leitch. And also, well, these are the pots, but yeah, I was going to tell you about the wood. Well, as you can read in the label, it says that this whiskey, it has been finished in Rioja cask that previously held Rioja wine from Spain. And well, that's basically the reason why the color of the whiskey, it looks so pink. Definitely the Rioja cask, it's adding this whiskey these characteristics, not only color, but some flavors as well. So let's talk about that later on. And well, let me tell you about the distillation process. During the distillation process, well, you can see these are the pot stills right at the distillery, and the pot stills, they have been designed to produce reflux. When you produce reflux during the distillation process, you will be able to create a very light, softer, and more delicate spirit in comparison to other distilleries. And well, if you look at the top of the pot still, which it looks like this, it has this very unusual like S shape. So what happens when you have a pot still like this? Well, the idea is to create reflux. So let me give you more details about this. How the pot still affects the flavor of your whiskey. Generally speaking, when you mature whiskey in a very tall and thin pot still like this one, which is the case of Glenmorangie, for example, you will be able to create a very floral, fruitier, and delicate spirit. As opposite to this kind of pot still, which is smaller and fatter, is the case of Springbank and Campbelltown, for example. Uh, when you produce alcohol in a small pot still like this one, the outcome, it will be a much more richer, complex, and flavorful spirit in comparison to a pot still like this one. So the idea of this very tall and thin pot still is to create reflux, as they do in Tobermory distillery. I know that the pot stills, they don't look exactly the same as in the graphic, but the design and the shape of the pot still, the idea is to create and to enhance the production of reflux. So what is reflux? Basically, during the distillation process, when you increase the temperature of the pot still, and the alcohols evaporate, they will go up. They will go up through the neck of the pot still, and they will reach the top, and they will just condensate, and they will become liquid again, and that's how you extract the alcohol, basically. So the reflux is usually when you have a very tall pot still, the alcohol, it goes up in form of vapor, but then it condensates in the middle of the pot still, in the middle of the neck, so it flows down again, and then it evaporates again, so it goes up, but then it condensates again, so it goes down, and then evaporates, goes up, and then goes down again. So this process, it happens again and again and again, and this is well known as reflux. So the more reflux you create, the lighter, softer, delicate, fruitier, and easier whiskey will be to drink, as opposite to the production of alcohol in this kind of pot still. Okay, and well, what about the barrels? I briefly mentioned this already. So what they do here is going to be a combination of two barrels. On one hand, hogshead, American oak barrels that previously held American whiskey, and then it was finished in the in the Spanish barrel that previously held Rioja wine from Spain. And well, to be honest, I have to confess, Rioja wines are one of my favorite wines all over the world. I truly believe that Rioja, it's a great region. Rioja, it's a region in Spain, and they will produce, a very particular style of wine in the Rioja region in Spain. Usually, Rioja wines, they tend to be very full-bodied, very rich, and very complex. They deliver lots of characteristics of like a wood, very dry, very woody, and also very corky. You will find this kind of cork flavor in the Rioja wine. It's one of my favorite wines. When I tried this one for the very first time, I was very surprised. I thought it was like really, really good quality. So the whiskey that you guys are drinking right now from Leche, from Tobermory, it has been partially matured in the Rioja cask from Spain. So enjoy that. And well, what type of flavors you can expect from this particular whiskey? Before I show you the tasting notes, let me give you some of the, well, some like more detail about this whiskey here. So let's talk about peat, because obviously in the production process, peat it's involved. So what is peat? Well, peat usually, well, if you remember well, and when I show you the map of Scotland, generally speaking, whiskies from Islay, from this particular region in the west coast of Scotland, they tend to be very, very peaty. So it's the case of Ardbeg, Lagavulin, Lafroig. What can you expect from whiskies from Islay? Usually, you will expect very medicinal flavors. It can be TCP, iodine, carbolic, hospitals, lean, tar, diesel, oil, and seaweed. Like how like very medicinal. Some people might be thinking like, oh wow, this is not very appealing. Some people love it, some people hate it. It's totally up to you to decide that. But well, just to let you know, these are the main characteristics from whiskies from Islay. However, when you produce smoky whiskey somewhere else in Scotland, which is the case of Isle of Mull and Tobermory Distillery, or even somewhere else in mainland Scotland, it can be Speyside, Highlands, Lowlands, anywhere, the style of smokiness it's different. It's not as medicinal as the one on Isla. It's gonna be a different style. Instead of being medicinal, it's gonna be more smoky. Like bonfires, burn logs, fire ash, incense, smoked salmon, seashells, smoked oysters, for example. This kind of flavors you can expect from this particular whiskey. So instead of TCP or iodine, probably you will get more about like the burn logs, the fire ash, smoked salmon, for example. Think about this: smoked meat, smoked bacon, and maybe you are able to identify these flavors. And well, also, since the whiskey has been matured in sherry cask, so let's go to the winey triangle of the map. So we have got here, so the winey note, you can expect oily, sherry, nutty, and chocolate. Sherry, in this case, I would say it's going to be a very important characteristic. Not particularly sherry, but some kind of wine, like red wine, Rioja wine, if you like. And some nuttiness as well, like the hazelnuts, the walnuts, almonds, marzipan, these kind of flavors, and maybe some dried fruits as well, like sultanas, raisins, figs, apricots, prunes, dates, even fruit cake you might be able to get there. I totally understand if probably you don't get any of these flavors, because I know that the smokiness of this whiskey it's quite predominant. So so yeah, like the bonfires and the burn logs and maybe a little bit of these medicinal flavors, but not as much as the whiskeys from Islay. Okay, so according to their tasting notes, they say that this whiskey in the nose, it's Turkish delight and rose petals balanced with candied fruits, grapes, leather, and peppery spice. In the palate, it's going to be creamy, almonds, barley, and sweet malt, raspberries, vanilla, and cocoa, cinnamon, a hint of freshly cut grass. It's going to be very fresh as well. And the finish, some smokiness, it lingers, red fruit, and sea spray. Thanks to the proximity of this whiskey in the coast in the Atlantic Ocean, well, definitely you might be able to spot a little bit of this sea spray involved in the environment of the island. Okay, let's continue. And it's time to go for the last whiskey of the night, which is gonna be this one here, the Big Pete. So please, guys, pour yourself a dram of the Big Pete, which is the last one. And well, as its name suggests, this one here is gonna be very, very big on peat. And well, let's see what happens. So please, guys, go ahead and take a look of the color, give it a smell, give it a try. Think about the aftertaste and mix it with a little bit of water if you like, and let's see how it goes. This whiskey here, it's a blended malt Scotch whiskey. So far we have had a blended Scotch whiskey, which it's a combination of single malts and single grains. Leche, it's 100% single malt, distilled at only one distillery and only one grain, which is the malted barley. And the Big Pete, it's going to be a combination of several single malt whiskies from Islay in this case. So, by the way, this is the core range of the producer. This is Douglas Lane. So Douglas Lane, they don't produce whiskey. They don't have a distillery. What they do is to go to several distilleries across Scotland. They will try to find the best casks that they can get, and they will create their own recipes and their own whiskies. As these whiskies that you can see in the screen, this is the core range of the company. The Epicurean, it's the lowland blended whiskey. This one here, Timur's Bestie, is the Highland blend. Scallywag is the Speyside blend. Rocky Oyster is the Western Isles blend, and Big Pete it's the blend from Islay, basically from Isle of Islay, which is this particular region in the west coast of Scotland. So what kind of whiskies you can expect here? Ardbeg, Lagavulin, Lafroig, Bowmore, and there's even a whiskey that it doesn't exist anymore, which is Port Ellen. I don't know if you guys have heard about Port Ellen. So yeah, these guys, Douglas Lane, they managed to find barrels from Port Ellen, and they involve a little bit of this Port Ellen in the mix of this particular whiskey that you guys are drinking just now. So a whiskey that it doesn't exist anymore. However, they have plans to rebuild the distillery and to yeah, like bring the distillery to life again. So they are still working on that. But right now they don't have whiskey available, so they managed to find this particular whiskey here for the blend. Okay, so what is peat? This is how it looks. This is like the peat that you can, I assume you have seen peat before, just in case this is how it looks. It's like think about oil or petroleum, but in a solid way. It has thousands of years of natural formation, and distilleries, they usually source the peat from the land, from the fields in Scotland. They will burn it into some sort of ovens like this one, and then the malted barley laying on the malting floors, the malted barley will absorb all of this smokiness created by the burning peat. And the more time you expose the barley to the smoke of the burning peat, the smokier your whiskey will be. In this particular case, the peat, it has been exposed for a very long period of time. Therefore, it's absorbing all of this smokiness, peatiness, like iodine, and very medicinal flavors that you can expect on many of the whiskies from Islay. And also, generally speaking, when you want to produce a very smoky, peaty whiskey, it's usually quite young in age. Peat and well-mature whiskies, they don't go well, because usually peat, the smokiness, it tends to dissipate over time. So this whiskey that you guys are drinking, it will be around maybe 6 or 7 or maybe 8 years old, but no more than that. So it's supposed to be a young blend and a young style of whiskey, and that's why you are able to feel this very powerful medicinal smokiness that you can get from this particular whiskey. What are the main flavor profiles or the main tasting notes? Yeah, like all of the medicinal flavors I showed you before: the TCP, the iodine, carbolic, hospitals, lintal, diesel, oil, and seaweed. Okay, and well, just the last story of the tasting and the whiskey tour across different whiskey regions and whiskey producers. So what were the 3 most important factors that helped the whiskey industry to kick off during the 17 and 1800s? So the first one, this picture here on the left-hand side, it represents the development of the blended whiskey. Remember the whiskey blenders I showed you before? So at the beginning of the 1800s, they discovered that by blending whiskeys from different regions and grains and distilleries, they were able to achieve better quality, more consistency, and a relatively lighter, softer, and more delicate whiskey to drink. They started to commercialize all these whiskeys to different countries. Of course, London, it was a very important market for Scotch whiskey, and soon after all over the world, all over Europe, Asia, etc., etc. The second most important factor, it was this one here, this picture, which represents the collapse of the cognac industry in France. So the distilleries of brandy or cognac, they couldn't. So in 1864, there was like a plague that completely exterminated the vineyards in France. It was like 80% of the industry was completely exterminated. So it was by a plague called phylloxera or phylloxera. It was like a teeny tiny insect that started to eat up all the grapes. So distilleries of brandy or cognac, they couldn't get the main ingredient, the grapes, to produce more brandy or more cognac. So what was the second brown available spirit in the market? Well, of course, was whiskey. And many of these French cognac drinkers, they immediately jumped to Scotch whiskey consumption and they started to drink whiskey like crazy. So today in France, they will consume more Scotch whiskey in 1 month than the total amount of cognac that they will drink in one entire year. So as you can imagine, these French guys, they really, really love their whiskey and they are massive, massive consumers. France is one of the most important market for Scotch whiskey exports. It's usually the top market or the second best market after the States. However, consumption per capita, it's the second biggest country in the world. The first one, do you know which one is it? Uruguay. Uruguay is going to be the first one. That's where they consume more whiskey in the world, like per capita. Also, bear in mind, it's a teeny tiny country. Only 3 million people live there, like 3.5 or something like that. So that's the reason why. And the second country in consumption per capita is going to be France. These people, they are like insane about any kind of Scotch whiskey. Okay, and the third factor, the third most important factor that helped the whiskey industry to kick off, it was the development of the rail network in the UK. So distilleries from the Highlands, from the north, they managed to transport whiskies to the main ports in Scotland, like Glasgow or Edinburgh, and from Glasgow and Edinburgh to the rest of the world. From Glasgow, for example, they were shipping lots of whiskey to the States, to the Americas and the Caribbean, and from the Americas and the Caribbean, the ships, they were coming back to Scotland full of tobacco and rum. So this exchange of products, it helped a lot the whiskey industry to kick off. Something similar happened with India, for example. They were shipping lots of whiskey to India, and then the boats, the ships, they were coming to Scotland full of like spices and food and fruits, etc. So in India, by the way, it's also one of the most important markets for Scotch whiskey exports. And India today, it's the biggest consumer and like one of the biggest consumers and the biggest producers of whiskey in the world. So from the top 10 of the best-selling whiskey brands in the world, only one is Scotch, which is Johnny Walker. Only one is American whiskey, which is Jack Daniels, and the other 8 brands are all Indian whiskies. So as you can imagine, these people in India, they also like their whiskey and they produce massive, massive quantities. I would say it's more about quantity rather than quality, except for maybe 2 or 3 brands like proper single malts that you can find in the UK today if you want. Okay, let's continue here. So these are the 3 most important factors. Remember, the development of blended whiskey, the collapse of the cognac industry in France, and the development of the rail network and the routes of commerce worldwide. Okay, and well, according to their tasting notes, so well, this whiskey, I assume you know already what are the tasting notes, but well, just in case, in the nose, it's salty, it's very coastal, hints of ash. In the palate, it's ashes once again, sweet tar, beaches, smoking chimneys, and the finish, salinity last on the finish, along with peppery warmth, smoke, and phenolic quality. So definitely this whiskey, it's very smoky, very medicinal, lots of phenols going on there, and it's considered to be a heavily peated blended Scotch whiskey from Isle of Islay. Okay, guys. So well, I hope you have had enjoyed this one. I totally understand if you didn't like it too much. I know it's not a whiskey for everybody, but well, remember the tour and the tasting experience is just to give you like a very nice overview of Scotch whiskey, Japanese whiskey, and Irish whiskey, so you can like compare and choose your favorite at the end of the day. Okay, guys, this is the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for your time, for your support, for your attention. It's been a pleasure. Follow me on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, etc., under the name of Once Upon a Whiskey, and I'll be more than happy to continue with the conversation.